Okay everyone, we're going to talk about the family in this video, and we're going to be paying special attention to how the family is socially constructed. That is the way and the different ways that the family as organizing kinship relations and relations between people within communities, how that varies across time and place. So we'll see that the family is not this uniform, normal, natural part of our world, but is a socially produced phenomenon. Now, what is the family? It is true, and I think it's important to recognize that the family, some idea of the family, is basically a universal human institution. More or less all societies have some notion of the family, some way of bringing together kinship relations and relations within a community. And so the idea of the family, the notion of a family, is a human universal, but the way that this particular institution gets organized, well, that is particularly social. Now, what we often hear, and the way that often politicians and commentators in our society today talk about the family, is oftentimes to bemoan the decline of this thing called the traditional family, to worry about the decline of the traditional family, to worry that this institution of what we can think of as a traditional family is eroding in some way, and this is going to produce all kinds of negative consequences. This is the concern. But that raises an important question for us to ask, which is, well, what exactly is the traditional family? What do we mean when we talk about the traditional family? Now, these images that I'm showing you here is what I think these commentators have in mind. What it seems to be the case that when we think about the family, these are the kinds of images that pop in our head, where you have a heterosexual couple who are living in a marriage and then have a couple of kids attached to them, right? So the sort of traditional family in this case really looks just like this, a variety of forms that is organized around a heterosexual couple and their kids. And this is, when we talk about the traditional family this way, what we have in mind is what we often call the nuclear family. This institution that's organized around a man and a woman having 2.5 kids, right? And that's the sort of image that we have for the traditional family. But I think it's really important to ask ourselves, well, how traditional is this traditional family, right? If we're going to talk about this as some sort of a tradition, then we would expect to see across time and place that this was the fundamental way of organizing kinship relationships within communities, right? That this would be the primary way that the family would have been organized. And so it's worth asking, just as an empirical question, really, is this the case? Is this traditional family the way that across human societies the family has been organized? So let's actually look then across cultures to see, what does family structure actually look like? And does it mirror this kind of nuclear family imagery that we're given this label of traditional? Well, let's start in Imperial China. So I'm just going to go through a whole series of examples to talk about. Now, by the end of the Shao Dynasty, around 771 BCE, emperors in Imperial China had a queen, 3 consorts, which are basically what we could think of as major wives, 9 wives of second rank, 27 wives of third rank, and then 81 concubines, right? So this is a very different family structure than we might expect, than we would be thinking about when we're thinking about what is traditional. Well, let's look at the Nayar of Malabar, which is in southern India. In this cultural context, a tribe will borrow a groom from another tribe for a wedding ceremony, and he and the bride are never allowed to have sex, right? So what do we think about when we think about marriage? This is meant to be bonding together, these two people, and they're only supposed to have sex with one another. In this context, they're going to have a marriage ceremony that is going to bar them from ever having sex with one another. And now after the ceremony, the bride is then allowed to have sex with partners so long as they are approved by her tribe. Right? So this is another way, traditionally, so to speak, to organize marriage in the family. Let's look at the Mandaruku village in South Africa. In this village, men and women live essentially completely separate lives from one another, except for sex. They live in separate houses at different ends of the village. They eat and sleep separately from one another, and they really only interact with one another to have sex. Let's take a look at the Benaro of New Guinea. Here, the woman must give birth before she can marry a man. And she cannot marry the father of her child. So in the U.S., we have a particular term for this. We call this an out-of-wedlock birth, having a child before or outside of the confines of marriage. And many will find this something that is morally offensive. They will say that it leads to problems for kids down the road. And here, out-of-wedlock birth is essentially institutionalized into the context of marriage, so that it has to happen before marriage can take place. What about the Trobriand Islanders? Here, the parents do not raise children, but instead the wife's eldest brother is the one who raises a child. Let's look at the Na of southern China. They have, and this is perhaps the most radical deviation from what we're expecting in our context. The Na of southern China have no such institution that we could reasonably call marriage, and no, quite frankly, no real institution that we would call fatherhood. Instead, children are raised by their uncles, who is the primary male figure in the home, and there are no rules for who can mate with whom. Sex is organized largely through these anonymous and spontaneous sexual encounters that happen in the night, and there is no real institution of marriage and no sort of organization around who is allowed to have sex with whom, which effectively marriage organizes in our context. And so this demonstrates, I think, the variety of different ways that families can, in fact, be organized. It varies who is going to raise children, who is allowed to marry whom, what is the role of the spouse, what is the role of parents. All of these things are organized within the context of the family, but very differently from society to society. So when we talk about this idea of the traditional family, these empirical realities, these examples that we have across cultures, when we begin to empirically examine this idea of traditional family and we look across context, we see that the way marriage in the family is organized really is various from place to place. And so there's no real reason then to speak of this idea of the traditional family. So let's actually then, given this, let's think about some of the current trends in the family structure that we've experienced in our own lifetimes in the last decade or so. One of the most notable changes came in 2015 in the Obergefell decision in the U.S. Supreme Court, which basically legalizes same-sex marriages across all 50 states in the U.S. Right? Prior to this, there was in fact a law in the book basically saying that no state had to recognize same-sex marriage and define marriage as between a man and a woman, and this essentially overturns that and makes same-sex marriages legal across the United States. And this seems to us in the context, and many people saw this as a major kind of radical shift that was undermining the family structure, but really the way to think about this is as a reorganization of the family structure. Right? It's really does not in and of itself seem to be something to inherently worry about. Rather than undermining the family, it's transforming or changing the idea of the family itself. And the same is true if we think about cohabitation. One of the most notable trends especially in Europe, but we're seeing it now in the U.S., is the rise of cohabitation. So in the U.S. in 1995, about 7% of never married adults were cohabitating. By 2014, this had essentially doubled to 14% of never married adults cohabitating. So in this context, this looks like an undermining again of the family structure, but really, in some sense, it's bringing us in line with many European countries where cohabitation is becoming the norm for many relationships, and marriage becomes something that may or may not then happen later. So when we're thinking about all of these changes that we've experienced in our own lifetime, it's worth sort of recognizing here and putting this in broader historical and broader cross-cultural context to recognize that the way the family is organized is a social construction. It is a social institution. That means to say it has a set of rules that are underpinning that, but those are rules that are not written into the laws of nature, but instead are organized by societies. How we define marriage and the family, in fact, varies across time and across place, and it's really only in modern Western societies where we have this focus on the nuclear family, organizing that around the idea of love. And this is what the work of Stephanie Kuntz really highlights for us. So think about the family then not as something that's a kind of natural set of kinship relations, but in fact is a socially constructed institution. All right, we'll see you guys later.